Every year, a TiE team recruits an exceptional young entrepreneur to inspire us all. So this year's entrepreneur has been named to the Forbes 30 under 30. If you are a software developer, you probably used their product. And so please welcome Armon, co-founder and CTO of HashiCorp. In 9 years, he has helped make the company into a powerhouse with 1,500 employees, over $10 billion in market cap, and over 100 million downloads of their open source software in 2021 alone. Interviewing him is the investor who believed in Armon's vision and wrote the first check into HashiCorp. Please also welcome Navin Chaddha, who heads Mayfield Ventures. Navin has been named a young global leader by the World Economic Forum, and he is ranked on the Forbes Midas list of top 100 tech investors for 14 times. As an entrepreneur, Navin has co-founded or led 3 startups, and he's also an active philanthropist. Please welcome Armon and Navin. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to TiEcon Day 1. I have the great pleasure of having Armon, co-founder and CTO of HashiCorp, which went public in December of last year with over 15 billion in market cap. Armon, I want to start by thanking you for being here with us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Navin. It's a great pleasure to be here and get to speak at TiEcon with everyone.
Absolutely. So let's start by what HashiCorp does for the audience.
Sure, yeah, to keep it relatively simple, we sort of started HashiCorp almost 10 years ago with a pretty simple idea, which was how do we make it easy for development teams and application teams to build their next generation set of applications in cloud. It sounds like a simple problem, but of course there's a lot of challenges around how do you provision and manage the underlying cloud infrastructure, how do you secure all of those assets and secrets and data, how do we do the networking challenges across all of those different multi-cloud environments, and how do we manage the application lifecycle. So as a company, we kind of focus on 4 layers, but it's a very simple goal, which is enabling the application teams to efficiently deliver applications in a cloud environment.
Great, great. And it's been a delight working with you throughout this journey. Actually, it'll be helpful for the audience to also talk about your background and how did that lead to you founding a company. It's always good with TiEcon and with TiE entrepreneurs to know what the real story behind an entrepreneur is and what leads them to starting a company.
Yeah, happy to share. So it actually goes back all the way to the time that me and Mitchell Hashimoto, my co-founder, we actually spent at University of Washington together. So both of us were there studying computer science when we first got a chance to meet each other. And that was actually in the context of an academic research project. So we met doing research at University of Washington, and then started cutting our teeth on some of these problems around how do you build applications in cloud, how do we sort of manage things at scale, very much in the academic environment. But then as we went on to do internships and then graduated college and went to work in industry, working at small startups in the San Francisco Bay Area, we ended up realizing that all those problems around cloud infrastructure, application management were sort of unsolved. And so we sort of kept asking and thinking to ourselves, eventually someone's going to solve these problems. And at some point it felt like 6-7 years into cloud, nobody had really done it. And so we sort of looked to ourselves and said, you know what, we're practitioners, we're the developers ourselves, we're the engineers using these tools, and so we're our own customer. So we said, can we start HashiCorp and really be our own first customer and really build the tools, build the products that we would want to use to solve these problems, because we know the problems, very, very well. We're the kind of end user ourselves. And so that ended up being kind of the push for us. And it really came from just talking to a bunch of our startup peers and bigger company peers, and everyone saying, hey, there's not a good answer to this. And we built the same set of tooling 3-4 times that we said, you know what, let's do it once and for all. And that really is what sort of started HashiCorp.
That's great. So were you an accidental entrepreneur with your co-founder, Mitch? And I'll talk about your guys' partnership as we go deeper. Or was entrepreneurism always running in your blood and there was this desire always to start a company and have impact on the world?
No, I'd say we were both probably more in the accidental camp. I think we were open to it, and in university we ended up starting a little startup group where we very much got a team of 5 people together, and we were brainstorming various ideas. So I think we had an entrepreneurial bent, and I think we really wanted to find ways to sort of innovate and participate in sort of the startup ecosystem. But I think we didn't start a company saying, let's start the company and then figure out what our idea is. Right? It wasn't like we're starting the company for the sake of having a company or for the sake of being a founder. We really started with the problem and said, this is a real problem, right? And we see this over and over again, and nobody's solved it, and we're passionate about it. And so in some sense, we felt like the problem came first, and the vehicle for us to solve it was like, let's go form a company around it. But it wasn't the other way around. We didn't start with the company and then go looking for a problem.
Yeah, no. I think like I always say, right, like at the end, right, like people build companies, but companies are built by identifying a real pain point and making sure your product is a painkiller, not a vitamin. So one thing, right, our first time founders especially want to learn about choosing your co-founders, and the partnership I have seen between Mitch Hashimoto and you is like very unique, right? Like you guys can complete your sentences. You guys are always watching each other, helping each other grow. So any advice on how founders should choose their co-founders and why are they important?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I see some people try and go to like, founder, almost speed dating events to try and find a founder. And to me, that seems like such a scary idea, is that you picked your founder after, a 30-minute chat. Because I think for me and Mitchell, it started from a deep friendship first, right? And we spent many, many years together as, in undergrad together, and then as colleagues, working side by side before we ever became kind of co-founders together. So, I think at the heart of what it really is I think we have such a deep mutual trust and respect that anytime we have a disagreement or anytime we have sort of a challenging discussion, I think what makes it so powerful for us is our ability to sort of set our ego aside, right? Because we know that it's like, hey, if I'm saying something, it's not because I'm attacking Mitchell personally, or if he's critiquing my idea, it's not because he thinks worse of me as a person. It's that we both have such high trust and respect that that's almost like not a question. We sort of set that off the table, that it's like, hey, we know we're both asking and saying these things because we're trying to come up with the best answer for the company, or we want the best idea or the best product. And so I think that ability for us to kind of move beyond our ego to really focus on like, what's the best thing here for the user, the company, the product, is really what makes it such a successful partnership. And it's never about either of our egos or, feeling like, hey, there's a lack of mutual trust or respect or, whatever it is. And I think that's what makes the partnership so successful, because a startup, everyone will tell you it, and it's one thing to feel it, which is like, it is a roller coaster. You have your great days where you're riding high and you feel like, indestructible, and you have your lows, right? And I think your ability to sort of ride both of those out really depends on the strength of that relationship with your partner.
No, I think like I always say, right, like if co-founders 1 + 1 = 2 is not enough, it better be like a 5 or a 6. But I've seen like 11, the 10x factor with you guys, right? Another interesting thing, right, like company building, as you talked about, is always like with lots of ups and downs, but it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. And I believe the founding mission and values of a company are critical. And in your case, you guys came up with the Tao of HashiCorp. Like, any advice for founders on how important it is right from the get-go to write down the values and the mission of a company? Because it's been a great case study for many of our companies to learn from you guys.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and I think it honestly has become even more important as we're all moving to sort of a hybrid remote world. Is this idea of, I'll push it even a little bit further. I'll call it sort of the intentionality of the business, right? I think we've always been hyper intentional about sort of all of the decisions we make, all of the kind of, the culture we want to build, the process we want to build, et cetera. And so I think for us, at the heart of that intentionality is, can we really document it and be super explicit and honestly get comfortable to the point where we put it on the public internet, right? So when we talk about like the Tao of HashiCorp, for example, that's really our product design ethos. And so from the very beginning, before we'd even written all of the products, we sat down and said, you know what, how do we want all the products to look and feel and behave? And what's the sort of, in some sense, the deeper belief we have about how infrastructure software should work to begin with? And so that's really where the Tao started, was for us saying, let's capture what those beliefs are, document them, and go so far as to publish them. Because I think that act of publishing it now lets you bring your users, your customers, your community with you, for them to say, you know what, that is a set of principles I believe in. Or it gets them to kind of consider, hey, why don't I operate my infrastructure that way? Or why do I maybe have a different set of beliefs? So I think it allows you to sort of have a different level of conversation, which is less about the features and more about the philosophy. Now, I think we did the same thing around the culture of the business, and we call that one the principles of HashiCorp. So if the Tao for us is around our products and sort of the design ethos, then the principles are very much about the culture, right? And so, I think oftentimes we hear people throw around the sort of phrase of culture fit. And anytime I talk about it, I sort of put it in quotes, because I think the problem with a phrase like culture fit is, for most organizations, they don't define it, right? If you ask an organization to say, what is culture fit for you? It becomes one of these, I know it when I see it type of things. And that very quickly, I think, becomes exclusionary. I think it becomes sort of an old boys club in terms of how it gets defined, because then it becomes the first 10, 20 people at the company who really get to define what culture fit is, right? It's not this fair, equitable thing. And so I think for us, we said we want to be really, really clear that the principles of HashiCorp, what we capture, what we document, that is culture fit at HashiCorp. They're one and the same. And in fact, we're going to publish it on our website, right? And so for us, it makes it this very explicit thing that we put into our review process. So anytime a candidate interviews, we screen them on the principles, right? And we have feedback. And when we talk about it, it's not like, oh, that person wasn't a culture fit. Because like, that's not useful feedback. We can say, you know what? That person seemed very dogmatic in their views. They didn't express a lot of pragmatism in how they make decision making. That's not a good fit for the HashiCorp environment. And so it lets us give much more fair feedback, both internally and to the candidates. But then it also self-selects. The kind of people who apply to HashiCorp are the kind of people who read those principles and say, you know what, that is an environment I want to be in. And so I think it's a two-way road. It helps us both internally, but it also helps us attract candidates that say, you know what, that's the right environment for me. Or they say, you know what, it's the wrong environment. It's not the kind of culture I want to be a part of. And that's great too, right? We don't want to talk to someone who thinks it's the wrong culture. So I think that, what I bring it back to is being really, really intentional always helps you to have a better quality of conversation, both internally, but also helps you sort of start the conversation externally, whether it's a candidate or a customer or a user. And so I think it's been super successful for us to really, document those.
And given that you were like first-time founders, right? Like these kinds of unique insights are not common, right? I've been doing this as an entrepreneur in VC for over 2 decades. So were there any role models or advisors, or you guys just inherently believed that this will be important to create a build to last company? How did you guys arrive to this stuff that laying the Tao and the principles is going to be so important?
Yeah, I mean, I think, in some sense, I won't take credit for some some totally unique insight here. I think for us, what we acknowledged was like, we are first-time founders. And so where can we learn from other organizations in terms of what are the best patterns, but what are the anti-patterns and the things we don't want to do? And I think the anti-patterns are in some sense just as important as the success patterns are. And so for us, I did spend a little while at AWS and Amazon. And so I think what I saw there was their notion of their leadership principles, and they have a very document-driven culture, right? The sort of famous Amazon 6-pager. So there was a lot of those aspects that we actually borrowed from organizations like Amazon in terms of written culture, being very explicit, being very intentional. And then when we looked at the principles, actually, some of the folks we looked to, maybe this might be a strange example, but it's actually Ray Dalio and the Bridgewater Group. So for folks that haven't studied Bridgewater, they have a very unique culture. They believe in sort of notions of radical transparency. They have, a published book of the sort of corporate principles. that's now in sort of publication format. And so it was early exposure to some of those kind of environments, as well as then I'll call it exposure to some of the smaller, a bit more shoot from the hip Silicon Valley startups that we said, okay, there's parts of that we don't want to replicate. That we really synthesized it and said, okay, what's going to be a good blend for us, right? I think a culture as extreme as Bridgewater is hard to scale. But then, I think a lot of the aspects of Amazon's culture made sense, and we brought that in. And then, really looking at, how do you make it a very professional and inclusive work culture as well? Those were all super important. So we sort of blended, I think, a lot of the, the best of worlds that we saw from other great organizations, and tried to sort of, make it uniquely HashiCorp from there.
No, that's great. And I think great learnings for everybody on that front. Not only were you guys unique in setting up some of the fundamental culture and values, but you and Mitch also made the decision and came to us, to the board, and said like, hey, we need to bring a CEO. And you guys and all of us were extremely lucky in finding Dave McJanet, who has been a great addition. And he's really I always look at him, the three of you as a trio, along with the team you have built. So what was the reasoning behind that, right? That's also a black swan event. Founders don't like bringing in CEOs, and Mayfield is always people first. We believe in following the founder's direction. What was the thinking behind it? Because it's your baby, like you guys started the company, getting in a CEO. What was going in your head, right? Like, would be just good to share with people. And the company has been extremely successful, and you guys are still driving the vision, the technology, the brain power behind the stuff, but you decided to bring in a complementary person who had more work experience, more GTM background, more scaling organization. So what was the reason, right, like to do that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good one. And it goes back to sort of relatively early in the company's life, sort of, 3-4 years in. We were really at the sort of juncture of defining what was sort of going to be the kind of customer focus area for us, as a business, meaning when we grow up, are we going to be really an enterprise focused business and go after that part of the market? Or are we going to be more of a mid-market SMB business and design around a more transactional business? And I think ultimately we decided, when we grow up, given the space we're in, focusing on enterprise makes the most sense for us. And so we made that decision and sort of pivot internally from a focus area. I think the question then for me and Mitchell then became, who's the right leader for that, right? And I think, as founders, obviously we had maybe I'll call it the moral authority. And I think if we wanted to be CEO, we could have been. But I think as we reflected on it, and I think it goes back to that notion of sort of setting your own ego aside. I think the question to us was, what's more important? Is it more important that one of us holds the title of CEO? Or is it more important that the company succeeds? Because if it's important for us to be CEO, fine, we can solve that. We'll be CEO, but we're going to make 1,000 mistakes along the way, right? Because we've never done it. We've never built an enterprise organization. We've never built an enterprise sales force. We've never built an enterprise go-to-market, right? So all of those things, I don't think they're unlearnable, right? You can do them, but you're going to make mistakes along the way. So the question is, that 1,000 mistakes that you're going to make, is that going to jeopardize the business, right? Any startup, there's some tolerance, right? The answer is not you can only make 0 mistakes, but there's some threshold where you've made so many mistakes you kill the company. And then on the other side, it's like, could we bring someone in that no one's going to be perfect, right? That's not going to happen. But can you find someone who's been there, done that, and maybe they'll make 50 mistakes as opposed to 1,000? And so the question is like, does that, 95% reduction in mistakes, does that improve the odds that the company succeeds? And is that more important to us than our title? And I think when we sort of really interrogated it, we said, yeah, that's ultimately more important to us, right? Like if my title has to be chief janitor, then, so what? I don't really care. I'll happily do that. What matters to me is that the company's successful, the products are successful, the vision is brought to market. And so, I think once we sort of internalized that, then we said, yeah, the right thing to do is for us to sort of bring in the right person, whatever their title should be. Is it president, COO, CEO? It doesn't really matter to us. Let's find the right person who will drive the company's success and complement me and Mitchell's strengths, but then ultimately sort of check our ego, right? And really say, you know what, the title doesn't really matter at the end of the day.
Oh, very unique perspective and very, very helpful for everyone. So switching gears, right? Like you guys are a role model also on the front of building community, leveraging open source. Any learnings on that front? How should companies think about how important is the community? What do they open source? What do they provide as a SaaS service? What is commercial? So any key learnings you would bring out for the audience?
Yeah, I think there's so many. We could do a master class just on on open source
Yep.
strategy. I think at the heart of it is people often think about open source as a thing that you can sort of bolt on to any strategy as part of hey, this will be like a marketing effort. And I think that rarely works, right? I think you have to decide, and there's a bit of a binary choice here, which is, do you authentically commit to open source or do you not, right? Because I think anything in the middle, the community realizes pretty quickly it's inauthentic, and I think you get the worst of both worlds, to be honest. And I think if you authentically commit to open source, then what that really means is like, you have to make sure the product isn't, crippleware in the open source. It has to be that practitioners can use it, download it, extend it, and really see the true value of the tool in a purely open source motion. I think you have to then commit towards developer education, developer evangelism, right? So there's big investments that go into not just putting the code on GitHub, but building the communities around it, right? And so whether that's, putting developer relations, whether for us, we have our HashiCorp user groups around the world, we have HashiConf, which is our two, global conferences. So we spend a lot of time, money, energy in terms of really fostering a community around it. Our engineers interface with the open source community every day. Our product managers interface with the community. So we're very authentically committed to it. I think then as you talk about commercializing open source, I think the most important thing, and I've seen where, a lot of organizations struggle with this, is articulate a clear framework for what's commercial and what's open source. Because I think if you do it on an ad hoc or random basis, it becomes very easy to sort of upset your open source community because they feel like there's no rhyme or reason to how you're operating. There's no framework that they understand. First, I think we've always been really clear, which is, hey, solving the core technical problem, that's always open source for HashiCorp. Solving the organizational challenge around using that product, that's our commercial product. And I think that articulation and framing has always made it really clear for our community why something goes one way or the other, and they don't feel like it's just sort of random, right? So I think having that intentionality and being able to articulate it, really, really important. And I think maybe the most important rule is what you give to the community, you never take back. Yep. Right? They're very loss, open source communities are very loss averse. And so, maybe it's a mistake and you regret it, but I think you have to learn to live with some of those mistakes rather than try and take it back. Because I think that burns the trust of the community. So I think some of those become really important. From a commercialization viewpoint, I think obviously the market's evolved a lot since HashiCorp started. I think SaaS is probably the predominant and the right answer for most organizations. Obviously we have a large component of our business that's sort of self-managed open core. I think that's driven by the fact that, when we started this in circa 2012, most enterprises were not comfortable with the idea of SaaS managed infrastructure. And in addition, we're at the kind of a core infrastructure layer. We're not a high level application SaaS. So core infrastructure people tend to want to self-manage as well. So I think the answer depends slightly on what business you're in, but by and large, I think most enterprises have come around to the idea that SaaS is the future and consumption billing is the future. And, that's probably the right way to monetize it.
Yeah, no, I think that's been our learnings, having been involved in so many companies. But I think, as I was mentioning, right, and you just affirmed that, like SaaS is the way as companies go cloud native. So HashiCorp, switching gears, has had like so many opportunities. And in your role, right, like how do you help prioritize which products to build and how do you find product market fit? Because just amazing stuff happens once companies find product market fit. So any key learnings, because you can do a lot of things, right? And which you guys did, and some will work, some won't work. but how does one find product market fit?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some sense, it goes back to a little bit of like, in some sense, our origin, which was like we were the end users of this stuff, and so we understood the problem space intimately, right? Because we were the operators, we were the buyers of these tools, if you will. And so I think for, really at the heart of it is a lot of, I think, founders try and go for, they go on, I'll call it problem, searches or solution searches, which is they might start with an idea and then look for the problem that it solves. And I think that's almost the wrong way to do it. I think the right way to do it is start by identifying a real problem. And then by definition, if you can solve that problem, you have product market fit, right? Because if you know an organization has that problem and it's a painful problem, the more painful, the better, right? Then they'll be willing to pay to make that problem go away. Versus if you start from a solution and you look for a problem, there's no guarantee anybody actually has that problem, right?
Yeah.
And so I think this goes to kind of the core ethos of the company. We talk about this in the Tao, which is at the heart of everything that we build is we start with the user workflow problem. So when we're building any new product, we go into our customers, we go into our users and we say, show us a workflow problem you have that's really painful, right? I want this to be a thing you're actually doing every day of every week. Show me that thing. And hey, what if I could automate that for you? Or what if I could make that less painful for you? And then that's what we start building the product around. So when we talk about it with our sort of onboarding of new employees, at the heart of what we do is identify the workflow problem. Then we build the product around that workflow. It's around that, then we say, okay, let's go build a community of open source users and an ecosystem. And then finally, it's the sales piece of it where we're monetizing at sort of the highest commercial layers, that community of user base. But at the very heart of that onion, right, if we think about it in those layers, is like there's a user workflow problem that we started with. And I think by virtue of thinking about it in that order, right, problem first, then product, you're always, very likely to have a very tight product market fit, right? Because by definition, the product was built for the specific problem. Not always, right? You can be off the mark, but I think starting in that order makes it much, much more likely.
Got it. We are heading towards the end, right? So I'll try to keep it to a few key things and one answer, right? So what's something you wish you knew when you were founding HashiCorp? One thing, right? Which you will tell your younger self.
I would say know the target customer. I think we got a lot of heartburn by not being able to answer that question and saying it's enterprise until we're 4 years into the business, right? We ended up with the wrong products, the wrong marketing strategies, the wrong people, the wrong sales motions. We ended up having to fix all of that, but I wish I had known that 4 years earlier.
Got it. And then you're a big believer in giving back, right? You think it's important for every company to have social impact and help communities, right? And any key learning there?
Yeah, we started our social impact fund, really early on to sort of give back to the communities. I think anyone in this industry is sort of, we're so blessed in many different ways. And I think, all of us need to look for ways for how do we give back to our communities. Maybe it's the communities we came from, maybe it's, communities that we think are underserved or underfunded. But, I think, it starts with a sense of gratitude for everything we have and really saying, okay, we have a lot, and how do we give back to others who maybe don't have the same opportunities?
Yeah, and I would like to end by just asking you again, right? What's the biggest advice for people starting companies, right? Just one thing that comes to mind. You told us what you would do. Is it the same, or you would summarize it's something else?
I would say it's you just have to get on with it. And what I mean by that is I see a lot of people obsess over, I'm going to read every book on 0 to 1 or good to great. I'm going to go to 1,000 seminars and 1 million conferences, and I'm going to soak in all of this context and then I'll be ready. And the answer is every company, every situation, every market's unique, right? There's no playbook for it. Some of these innovations, you have to just jump into the pool and then solve the problems as you go, right? There's just no way around it, right? Because from all the webinars and books and whatever I've been to, none of them would have told me what I should do in my role at HashiCorp over the last 10 years, right? Like, yeah, they're all useful and interesting anecdotes, and maybe there's some frameworks that are helpful, but ultimately you just got to jump in the pool, right? And I think that would be my ultimate advice is there's no right moment. There's no level of learning that you're like, now I'm ready. I've read the 1,000 books about it. I'm ready now. I think you just got to get into the water, and I think you're going to have to solve the problems because they're going to be unique. They're going to be situational, and you have to kind of solve them in that context that only you're going to have. So I think in some sense there's a great, you should be prepared, but at the end of the day, you gotta start the journey somewhere.
Yeah, be an entrepreneur and just jump in. Love it, right? So I want to end by thanking you for taking your time, and on behalf of Mayfield and myself, for our entire team, it's been a pleasure working with you, Mitch, Dave, and the entire team right from your Series A. Thank you again for taking the time. It's been a real pleasure.
Likewise, thank you so much for making the time, and it's been great to be here and great to work with you.
What an amazing story from a young entrepreneur, Armon, and a Midas touch venture capitalist, Navin Chaddha, on what it takes to create a company with over 15 billion in market cap.